Hey, what's up everybody? It's Izzy from Powerlifting to Win, and although the programming series has taken us all over the powerlifting map, none of those stops are going to be quite as in your face as the program and the program author that we're going to be taking a look at today, and that is Jamie Lewis, who wrote Destroy the Opposition. And as you can tell by the title, Lewis is kind of an extreme guy. Anyways, for those of you guys who have never checked out his blog, Chaos and Pain, I just have to warn you, it is not safe for work, so don't try to pull that up if you're at work. You will see tits and profanity everywhere. But anyways, Jamie Lewis is a really interesting guy, one of the more unique personalities in powerlifting, as well as a hell of a lifter and writer. Now, some people hate Jamie Lewis and some people love him, but that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not he writes good programs. And here in the Powerlifting to Win programming series, all we really care about is whether or not the programs are any good. And in my opinion, Destroy the Opposition is one of the better ebooks on the powerlifting market. Now, at $20, it might be considered a bit pricey, but you get 200 pages of highly informative, great content. It is a bit offensive, I will warn you about that, but overall I do feel it's one of the better reads out there on powerlifting. Now, Destroy the Opposition is not a program book. It's not like reading 531 or The Cube or something like that. It is really what Jamie Lewis calls his opus on powerlifting, and that's a much more accurate way to describe it than a program book. Lewis peppers in his personal philosophy throughout the book, but the majority of what you get is actually a detailed history of both the powerlifts and the greatest powerlifters who ever performed them. So if you're the kind of person who just loves to see the routines of the all-time greats, this book is going to be a great resource for you, because for each lift, he goes over not only how that lift came about, but also he goes over the routines of the lifters who excelled at that lift throughout history. Now, in the very last dozen pages or so of the book, Lewis takes all of the stuff that he's discussed in the first, 180 pages or so, and he puts that into his own programs for everyone to use. And there are 5 programs in the book. There is a beginner program, there is a squat specialization intermediate program, there is a deadlift specialization intermediate program, there is a squat specialization advanced program, and there is a deadlift specialization advanced program as well. Now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the intermediate reviews, because I feel they are both a combination of the most interesting and the most relevant to the Powerlifting to Win audience. We've already reviewed a lot of beginner programs, and this one isn't that different. And as far as advanced programming goes, well, Jamie Lewis defines advanced lifters as anybody who's been lifting for more than 4 years. I just don't feel like there's a lot of people out there who are in that advanced category who care to see a review of the advanced programs. Now, if you want to see them, grab a copy of the book. They are pretty cool, and you'll probably enjoy learning about it. But for this review, we are going to center in on Lewis's intermediate programs, of which, again, there are 2. The squat specialization routine and the deadlift specialization routine. So without further ado, let's break those routines down. Now again, I do want to give you guys a fair warning. If you go out there looking at Jamie Lewis's blog or you pick up a copy of his book, know that his material is pretty offensive and includes a lot of profanity. His blog includes nudity and even porn and stuff. So if you are really offended quite easily, do not check out Lewis's material. Fair warning has been served. Now with that said, Lewis is highly flamboyant, kind of extreme, and again, offensive, but at the same time, the guy is really damn strong, well-researched, and a good writer too. So I suppose there's a trade-off to everything. Now, with that said, Lewis puts his money where his mouth is. He's not just an internet theorist. He's a former world record holder in the 181 weight class for raw powerlifting. He totaled 1705 at a body weight of 181 pounds with nothing but knee sleeves and a belt. That record has since been broken by Ben Puccio with a 1710 total. And Lewis also briefly held the 181 squat record without knee wraps. He squatted 650, which was broken by Vladislav Lukanin about a month later with a 672 effort. Nonetheless, Lewis has a great powerlifting pedigree. And really, Lewis's credentials are perhaps exceeded only by his extreme personality. And it's really no surprise that his programs tend towards the extreme as well. Lewis believes that all lifters should essentially pick between the squat and the deadlift for specialization purposes. Lewis is all about winning, so his strategies revolve around maximizing your total more than anything else. His belief is that because you lift relatively smaller poundages in the bench, you can't carve out as big of an advantage by specializing on that lift. And in Lewis's opinion, the problem with trying to specialize in both the squat and the deadlift at the same time is that they have a lot of overlap and they tax a lot of the same bodily systems. So in Lewis's opinion, you really need to pick one of them to dominate at in order to build that total that's going to allow you to beat other lifters specifically. So as such, he provides you with two separate routines depending on if you want to be a squat specialist or a deadlift specialist. We're going to take a look at both. The squat specialization routine looks as follows.
The basic gist here is that you're operating within 2-week microcycles. After you repeat 3 microcycles, so 6 weeks of training, you'll take a max on each lift and restart the program using your new max as the basis for determining your work set weights. You can see that this program features a lower body frequency of about 3 or 4 times in the first week and 5 or 6 in week 2. In each week of the microcycle, you're going to do squats 3 times per week. This being a squat specialization routine, you perform the deadlift only once per week. You're going to bench twice a week on a heavy light scheme, but you train your upper body between 3 and 5 times per week, depending on if you perform the optional workouts. While the program looks complex and somewhat intimidating, you have to realize that Lewis isn't suggesting that much more volume than what other programs suggest. However, instead of doing 8 exercises per workout, for example, Lewis has you doing 4 or 5. He has simply increased the frequency to make sure you still get all of the same work in. I'm generally a fan of this approach.
The deadlift specialization routine looks like this.
You can see that there are a lot of similarities between the deadlift specialization routine and the squat specialization routine. In terms of upper body, you're still training between 4 and 6 times per week, depending on if you do the optional workouts. You're going to bench twice per week on a heavy light scheme. You're also going to do a lot of pressing and occasional days where you hit some upper body accessories to round out the frequency. Lower body is where we see the biggest differences, obviously. Instead of squatting 3 times per week, you're squatting only twice per week on a heavy light scheme similar to the bench. Deadlifting, however, is up to twice a week. You pull heavy once a week, and there is either a medium or light session in between the heavy pulling. So as you can see, the program lives up to its name as a deadlift specialization routine. If you guys want a longer look at either of these programs in terms of just seeing these charts for a longer period of time, you can find a link to the article version of this video in the description box, and you can check it out in more detail there.
Despite Lewis being a powerlifter and this being a powerlifting routine, there isn't an explicit peaking plan included. Now, Lewis does suggest that you max out after doing his programs for 6 weeks, and he provides you a little schedule for how to do that. Here's what it looks like.
So here's the basic peaking plan. You can see it doesn't culminate in a meet or anything like that. Presumably, if you wanted to do a meet, you'd place the meet on this 7th week and you just max out at the meet instead of doing all these different days where you max out on only one lift. Now, Lewis has an entire book dedicated to peaking strategies, so perhaps that is why this one is particularly sparse in terms of dealing with the subject of how to peak for a meet.
Now, surprisingly, Lewis's routines don't actually include any form of periodization, by the way that we've defined it in the programming series. All you're really doing is repeating the same microcycle over and over and over again. And it's only 2 weeks long. Now, this is fine for early intermediate trainees because, as we know from the programming series thus far, intermediates don't really need anything besides manipulation of volume and intensity to make progress. However, late stage intermediates and early advanced athletes are going to benefit from longer cycles and some form of periodization, respectively speaking. 2 weeks probably isn't enough, even if you're repeating it over and over again. Now, because there's no periodization and the cycles aren't very long, I don't think this bodes well for long-term progress. I'm not sure how many cycles of this you can do before it would get stale. Nonetheless, we are reviewing these as intermediate routines, and it bears noting that intermediates don't really need anything besides variation in intensity and volume in the first place. So for most of you intermediates out there, this is going to work just fine. In terms of programming, Lewis does an excellent job of ensuring that there is appropriate variety in intensity and volume from workout to workout and week to week. You'll notice that you never go heavy on 2 exercises in the same workout. The only exception to this is a few days in the program where you go heavy on overhead press and barbell row at the same time. But it's important to keep in mind that because of the nature of these exercises, you're limited in the terms of the absolute poundages that you can handle on them. In other words, you can bench more than you can press and you can deadlift more than you can row. So it's easier to manage a recovery on these 2 exercises due to the simple fact that the absolute intensity is lower. You'll also notice that whenever you perform a heavy lower body workout, you take the next day off of lower body training. And for the most part, the same is true for upper body. The day after a heavy upper body training session, at the very most, you might do a light workout with some bodybuilding style assistance on the next day. But for the most part, you're taking that day off. And again, this helps manage recovery between sessions. The other important thing to note is that you never go heavy on the same movement inside of the same week. You have one workout which is a heavy workout that features higher intensities and medium volume, and then you have another workout which is a higher volume workout where you're doing like 6 sets of 6 at about 75% that could be considered a medium intensity workout with higher volumes. So you'll notice that it actually has a lot in common with the Texas method. And as we all know, that kind of a structure where you manipulate volume from being lower to volume being higher and intensity from being lower to intensity being higher throughout the week is a great way to structure training for the intermediate because it mimics the longer term pattern that you use for an advanced athlete where they go from higher volumes, lower intensities to lower volumes, higher intensities over a whole training cycle. But an intermediate's still so new to the game that they can do that inside of 1 week and do it every week to make progress. And Lewis definitely takes advantage of that fact with this style of intermediate programming. Again, it's just a smart way to set up your program. You can take another look at both specialization routines and you'll see that the separation of intensity from each week in the microcycle is highly intentional. Lewis has done a great job of ensuring intra and inter-week recovery. In my opinion, Lewis has done a pretty damn good job with specificity on this program. Not only are you doing most of your volume on the main competition movements, not variants, mind you, on the actual main competition movements is where most of your volume is, but you're also lifting heavy on the main competition movements. What a concept, right? You're lifting heavy so that you can lift heavy. Perfect. The other thing I like about this program is that there isn't an exorbitant amount of bodybuilding fluff. You're not going in there and doing 6 sets of 25 on the hamstring curl. Now, Lewis does include room for some of this bodybuilding style assistance, which in my opinion is necessary because we all know that if you don't put in a little bit of structured assistance work, most novices are just going to do it anyways. And if you let Johnny Novice go into the gym with no plan, he's going to do the 8-hour arm workout and mess up his whole training week. So best that we give him at least some structure for his bicep curls. Now, the one criticism that I do have of this program in terms of specificity is the overemphasis, in my opinion, on overhead pressing and barbell rowing. Again, I just don't believe it's necessary to perform the bench press and the overhead press in a 1-to-1 ratio. And that's exactly what Lewis's program has you doing. And in fact, on this program, you're going to be doing more barbell rowing than deadlifting. Now, it's not that the overhead press and the barbell row aren't awesome exercises that build a ton of muscle and make you stronger, because they absolutely do that. The question here is whether or not including these exercises is more effective than simply taking that volume, which is eating away at your recovery resources, and putting it towards more benching and more rowing. For example, we've already seen that on the squat specialization routine, you're squatting 3 times a week, so the deadlifting is cranked back to once a week. But what if you took out most of that rowing? Not all, but most of that rowing. Do you think you might be able to add in another light deadlift workout on each week? I think you could. Now, what if you cut back on the overhead pressing and some of the other upper body assistance? Do you think you could go from benching twice a week to benching 3 times a week and still recover? I think you could. And that's why, in my opinion, I'm just not a big fan of in what I estimate to be the American overemphasis on overhead pressing, barbell rowing, and assistance movements in general. We need to be doing more of our volume on the competition movements and close variations like close grip bench press and pause squats and deficit deadlifts. That's where most of your volume needs to come from. You know, if you're a bodybuilder or a power builder, which is somebody who I guess wants equal amounts of hypertrophy and strength, it's probably better that you do include this much overhead pressing and rowing. But if you're really interested in powerlifting, I just don't think it's necessary, and I actually think it's a bit detrimental to your total. Overall, though, you have to say that Lewis does a great job in terms of specificity with the Destroy the Opposition program. Now, because this is a somewhat percentage-based program, meaning that the work sets that you do each week are determined as a percentage of your max, this program works through basic progressive overload. Every 6 weeks, according to Lewis, you're supposed to go for a new max. And hopefully, if you're doing your job and the program is doing its job for you, that max is going to be higher. So each time you go through a cycle, you're going to be handling heavier and heavier weights. And as we all know, if you do something that you haven't done before, it's going to constitute an overload, which will help drive adaptation and further progress. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys are expecting me to jump all over this program for being too high frequency, but actually I'm not going to do that. This program is high frequency, but it's just because of the way that Lewis is organizing it. It's more of a split routine than it is a full body routine, which is perfectly legitimate, and I actually like the way it's organized. Now, I'm sure you're saying, but wait a minute, I thought 5 times per week or 6 times per week frequency was bad. But think about it like this. On these programs, you're squatting 2 to 3 times a week, deadlifting once or twice a week, and benching twice a week. Doesn't sound so crazy anymore, does it? Again, the high frequency is just a product of the way that Lewis is organizing the routine. Plenty of people report actually that they recover better on split routines. And all this really is a more frequent split routine than your traditional twice a week upper body, twice a week lower body. Lewis has kind of blurred the lines between full body training and split training with this routine, and it keeps the frequency nice and high. I like it. I think it's great for younger guys. Now, don't read this as me advocating for super frequent low volume workouts. These are not low volume workouts. It's just that, again, it's a split routine, so on some days you have high lower body volume and on other days you have high upper body volume. This is not the same thing as the Bulgarian method or something like that, where you go in and you might do 5 or 6 lifts total in terms of your working reps, and then you just repeat that same workout 6 or 7 times a week. Again, on this routine, that's not what you're doing. You're squatting 2 or 3 times a week, deadlifting once or twice, and benching twice. And you're just doing that on different days of the week, so the fatigue is more spread out, but it's not in small, tiny doses each time. Now, I do think that some of the workouts are kind of pointless. Like if you're doing a whole day that's mostly lower body and then you do one minor upper body accessory like curls, is that really going to have a huge impact on your upper body frequency? Is that really going to drive progress for your upper body? Not really, but we all know that you guys are going to do those bodybuilding movements anyways, so we might as well find an intelligent way to sneak them into the program, and I like the way that Lewis does it here. Don't read that as me saying that adding some bodybuilding stuff is optimal. I think it has its place, but for the most part, including it the way that Lewis has is just harmless, and it's a good way to satisfy the people that have a psychological need to do assistance work in order to feel like their program is good. Now, one thing I do have to say about this program is that if you have subpar recovery or you're an older trainee in general, I do think this is going to be too much volume for you. Let's just compare it to the Texas method. Now, the Texas method is known to be a brutal program that absolutely buries people. The Texas method has one day where you do a 5x5 at 72 to 77% or so of your max. Now, Lewis's program calls for 4 to 6 sets of 6 at about 75%. So you can say that the volume day on Lewis's medium days is just as difficult as, say, the Texas method. And on his light days, you're doing a 3x8 at, maybe 60% or so. The heavy days are way more difficult than the Texas method, where, for example, on the Texas method, you're doing 1 set of 5 on intensity day at about 85% of 1 rep max. On Lewis's program, you're doing 6 to 10 sets of 2 to 4 at 85 to 90%. So that is one hell of a training session. And I think that on some of these weeks, it's probably just going to be too much for those of you guys who are older or don't have very good recovery. If the Texas method can bury people, then so could this. Now, that said, for you younger guys, I do recognize that this is an ambitious amount of volume, but I personally don't think that most people do enough work as it is, and this is a great start in the right direction. I just had to include the caveat that I don't think it's optimal for all demographics. Unlike so many other popular programs, Lewis actually does incorporate quite a bit of respect for individual differences. His programs even have a bit of autoregulation. Now, while he doesn't use RPEs or fatigue percents, he does prescribe you with set and rep ranges. So that means depending on how you're feeling that day, you might do a certain amount of sets, and if you're feeling, good, you'll do towards the higher end of the range, and if you're feeling bad, you might do towards the lower end of the range. And similar with the rep ranges themselves. Instead of prescribing you a specific intensity, he prescribes you a specific rep range. So you know that if you're working in the 2 to 4 rep range, you are basically working at about 85 to 90% if you're doing multiple sets. So this way, no matter how you're doing that day, if you're picking a weight that allows you to do 2 to 4 reps for multiple sets and they're hard sets, you're working in the intended intensity range. And that's awesome. Now, all that said, I would still prefer to see a more sophisticated system of autoregulation revolving around fatigue percents rather than set ranges. And let's go ahead and examine why. Now, if you give somebody a range of sets to perform, there's a couple things that can happen. One, if they don't know how to listen to their body, they're just going to do the minimum or the maximum amount of sets every single time, depending on their personality. If they are an overachiever, they'll always do the maximum amount of sets, even if it beats the crap out of them. And if they are always making excuses as to why they don't feel good that day, they might always do the minimum amount. So when you're not giving somebody an objective way to determine their volume, they're going to determine it based on subjectivity. And subjectivity is suspect to basically people being pussies and also people being hard asses. So it's just not as optimal as having an objective measure for when to stop doing volume. Similarly, it's conceivable that there are some people with volume needs outside of the range that you're prescribing. So for example, an older guy, even 6 sets may be too many. But what about, the 18-year-old kid who's gaining 5 pounds a week because he's drinking a gallon of whole milk a day? Well, that guy might need to even do more than 10 sets to get the most out of his caloric intake. So again, a range, even though it gives us a degree of autoregulation, is not fully autoregulated. However, the most important thing to keep in mind here is that we don't know what effect the sets are having on our performance. So for example, if you are doing back-off sets, and let's say you work up to 300 for a set of 5, right? Now, if you take 5% off of the bar, that's going to give you 285. And if you keep doing sets until that 285 feels as hard as 300, that would be 5% fatigue. Now, instead, if we tell someone to do 5 sets of 5 as a back off, well, that 285 may end up being even harder than the 300 was. So it's more than 5% fatigue. However, on the other hand, if it's that go mad kid, maybe doing 5 sets of 5 doesn't make 285 as hard as 300, right? His fatigue doesn't accumulate as much as another person's does. So that's why we don't know what effect the volume that we prescribe is having on somebody's actual performance. We don't know how much fatigue it's causing. For an older guy, 5x5 can be crippling. For a younger guy, sometimes that's just another average workout. Look at Strongless 5x5, for example. Plenty of people do that program for a long time. Whereas for me, as a more advanced lifter, I know for a fact that if I was doing squat 5x5 3 or 4 times a week, I'd get crushed. So again, without any objective way to measure both volume and the effect that that volume is having, I just don't believe that volume can be optimal. Nonetheless, you still have to give Lewis props for at least addressing this to a degree, because having ranges does give you the opportunity to listen to your body and incorporate some degree of autoregulation. And I'm a big fan of that. I have a lot of the same training biases that Jamie Lewis does. Namely, I don't think people do enough work. I don't think they do enough total volume. I don't think they try hard enough. I don't think they're focused on winning. So it's really no surprise, considering that my biases are quite similar to Lewis's, that I enjoy his style of riding and that I enjoy his work. Now that said, my biases aside, I really do think that Destroy the Opposition is a highly entertaining, highly informative book, and it's worth your while. I would recommend picking up a copy of it if you consider yourself a student of the game, if for no other reason than because Lewis goes into such great detail about what all of the great all-time powerlifters have done to build their lifts to the level that they're at. Even if you don't want to do his programs, for example, I have no intention of ever doing his programs, it's still a good read. And really, as far as the programs go, they're pretty damn good too. So on that end of the spectrum, you're not losing either. Now, again, I'm pretty skeptical of the fact that his programs don't include any periodization, and I'm not a fan of his overemphasis, in my opinion, on overhead pressing and barbell rowing. And again, I would have liked to see more advanced, sophisticated autoregulatory practices, but I wouldn't hesitate to recommend these programs to the young, intermediate powerlifting trainee. They're pretty damn solid. Again, the volume is ambitious. You're going to be pushing yourself to work hard. It's going to require a certain dedication to powerlifting to show up to the gym 5 or 6 times a week that a lot of you guys just don't have, or you just don't have the time. But if you are a younger guy who has good recovery, this is a great way to really challenge yourself and try to push to the next level. I just wouldn't hesitate to recommend Lewis's program to the young intermediate powerlifter. I like the way it's structured. I like the general philosophy behind it, and I think it's a solid program. Is it optimal? I wouldn't go that far, but again, I wouldn't go that far about any program, really. I do like Lewis's programs, and if you guys are interested in picking up a copy of Destroy the Opposition, I'm going to throw a link to it in the description box for you guys. Overall, Destroy the Opposition gets a high rating from me, and again, I'll say it one more time. I would not hesitate to recommend these programs to you if you are a young, early intermediate lifter with a lot of time on your hands. Alright guys, the end of the programming series is now in sight. So if you have final requests, make them known, because once we move on to the nutrition section, I will not be going back to program reviews for quite a long time. Now the next program that we're going to take a look at is the Cohn-Philippi deadlift routine. Now I greatly resisted doing a review of this program, mostly because it bothers me that this isn't really the way that Ed Cohn trained his deadlift. I've studied Ed Cohn's career in depth, I have his DVDs. I've gotten a chance to talk to people who know Ed, and this is not what he did for the vast majority of the year. That said, this is one of the most popular deadlift routines ever created. It's basically like the Smolov for deadlifts on the internet. So we have to take a look at it. It's just too popular to ignore. If you're a fan of Cohn-Philippi, then go ahead and make sure you check in for this next review. It's going to be for you. If you guys found this content interesting, informative, or entertaining, please like, share, and send it out into the interwebs for me. If you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to pop on over to the Powerlifting to Win forums. There's a link in the description box, and I will address any issues that you do have personally. Now, if you guys are interested in customized, personalized coaching for powerlifting, including how to optimally incorporate autoregulation into a powerlifting routine, go ahead and shoot me an email at admin@powerliftingtowin.com. The email's in the description box, and we can talk more about my coaching services. Subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to check out powerliftingtowin.com for more great powerlifting information. Have a nice day.